Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. Fitch Ratings has affirmed Malaysia's long-term foreign currency issuer default rating at BBB+, with a stable outlook based on its strong and broad-based medium growth. And Fitch Ratings say that because of our persistent current account surpluses with a highly diversified export base. However, Fitch Ratings did weigh down Malaysia's high public debt rate and a low government revenue on top of an unstable political situation. In fact, Malaysia government debt has increased to 78.1% in 2021 from pre-pandemic levels of 65% in 2019. And on this basis, it's also important to take a look at the median of other BBB countries at 57%. So there's a lot to be had when it comes to how we look at Malaysia's government debt moving forward, considering that Fitch expects this trend to continue and only reduced slightly in 2022 from 78% to 77%. With this, there's a lot to unpack. Is there a conversation that needs to be had when it comes to rechanging or trying to reimagine the kind of possibilities that we can have when it comes to the economic model of the country? And here to discuss this further with me is Dr. Aslam Haneef, Professor of the Department of Economics at my alma mater, IIUM. Welcome to the show, Dr. Aslam. So let's unpack this story further, because Malaysia has always prided ourselves as a democratic country that embraces capitalistic structure, and it seems like this might not necessarily be the case moving forward because of the fact that this capitalistic model is now under threat because of the pandemic. And some might say that the vulnerabilities have been there in the first place. It's just further pronounced because of the pandemic. What would be some of your views when it comes to the economic model that Malaysia is going through right now?
Well, Ibrahim, firstly, the intro that you gave about the Fitch ratings shows that Malaysia has been part of the global system for a long time. Yeah? We have always been a trading nation. We have depended on trade and foreign direct investment. And generally speaking, probably in the 70s and 80s, this model has actually been able to give us some of those numbers that are always quoted to show that Malaysia has been a relatively successful economy. But I think indications, as you mentioned, even from pre-Asian financial crisis, the model that we were using had certain elements that probably go against the long-term sustainability of the model. And I'm talking specifically about the dependence on foreign labor, and most of the time this is cheap foreign labor. So Malaysia had become a industrial nation, manufacturing being our main exports, but depending on this cheap foreign labor to produce those goods in the electrical and electronic subsector. We also see after the Asian financial crisis that we have never been able to even reach those numbers that we were doing prior to the Asian financial crisis. For example, in the 90s, 10 years before the 98 crisis, we had growth rates of about 8%. In the last 10 years, it's probably closer to 4%, right? Even equity, which is something that we have prided ourselves, growth with equity has been our tagline. Even equity, we see that we are still clinging on to the old categories of equity, looking at it from a purely ethnic point of view. Political debates are always on this ethnic criteria, and yet we see new forms of inequality, spatial inequality, intra-ethnic inequality, and wealth inequality. Yeah? So I think the current model has to be seriously looked, and I'm not sure whether tweaking or fiddling with the current model that we have been using is going to be enough. And I think there is probably a need to relook at the entire model, especially if we just don't want to get back on track. People say we went off track and now we need to get back on track. But I think this pandemic has shown that we actually have to go beyond the old track. We have to actually set a new path, a path that can actually take us, to a better future.
One of the items that you constantly talk about in your lectures is, of course, the social market economy, something that has always been seen in Western democracies, particularly in France, in Germany, in Sweden. And being an idealist, I would like to argue that whatever model that works must be implemented. But in order for us to understand that, perhaps could you discuss a little bit more about the classical notion of what social market economy is all about?
Okay, the social market economy. Usually, when this term is used, you rightly pointed out, we look at Western Europe, as the examples of this social market economy. But I think in the literature written, one would go more to the German case after the devastation of the Second World War. In many ways, they had an opportunity to rebuild their entire framework, and this framework that they chose was termed the social market economy. And this social market economy, important to stress, it's a market economy, but it's a market economy based on social principles. So what makes the model quite interesting is that it tries to combine the free market with a kind of a social balancing agenda, attempt to combine, even to integrate elements of liberty with social justice. And often these two are seen as conflicting values. So the social market economy framework or model, is not just theory, because Germany and some of the other countries, probably in Western Europe, have managed to show that it can work. And I'm singling out Germany because if you think about it, just like Japan after the Second World War, two countries that were really devastated, at that point, totally rebuilt their economies. And in the case of Germany, not only did they do incredibly well in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, but when Germany, united again and they had to take East Germany on, they were still able to absorb and take Germany to what we know it today. So this model is not only just in theory, but I think we do have the practice of not only Germany, but even Japan and probably some of the other countries in Western Europe that have elements of the social market economy. And if I'm not mistaken, because of Germany's maybe big role in Euro, the European Union, I think even the European Union has kind of adopted some of the features of this social market economy.
So let's talk about the features of social market economy, Doctor.
Okay, so when you look at the literature that's written and you look at the practice that you find in some of these countries that have adopted it, definitely we are not going to be able to transplant it wholesale to Malaysia, right? We will have to we adopt, we adapt, and hopefully we are also able to innovate and make this social market economy something that is maybe suitable for the Malaysian context. Yeah, but I will argue that many of the basic premises or concepts or principles that you find in the social market economy are actually very compatible with the values of all communities in Malaysia. For example, rather than the self-centered, selfish maximizer that you have in the current global capitalist system, where this system has brought crisis after crisis over the last 30-40 years, the base of the social market economy is the social individual. This social individual is one that while working for herself, yeah, is also conscious that there is a need to also work for society. So it's a kind of a model that looks at the individual, not only looking for one own's personal gain, but also something that requires us to take others into our economic decision making. And in today's term, we always talk about the social impact or the environmental impact that you have. So social market economy is actually something that asks us to look at not only ourselves but to look at others in our decision making.
Sorry, we're already jumping on the issue of transplanting social market economy here, but my earlier question was the features of social market economy and how does this differ from that capitalist structure. You did touch about it in terms of the collective, the I versus we, but some salient other features must be different, or is it about the same?
Okay, so some of the other features that stand out is respect and even promotion of liberty of the individual. So freedom of the individual is very important. Private property is recognized. So the social market economy is certainly not a command economy. It is not a socialist model. And I think proponents of social market economy, take a lot of pains to say that they are not a socialist system. So it's a market economy, but it's a market economy that has more humane characteristics in it. Secondly, there is also the social balancing that I talked about. So while individuals are given freedom to pursue their interests, there is also this idea of solidarity that goes in the system. By solidarity here, we mean that taking every human being as being, human dignity is a very important part of the social market economy. Nobody should be treated as anything other than a human being,
Yeah.
and therefore,
That
this would.
means That means you have to widen the social network net, safety net. But that also means that there would be an understanding of a greater government spending being involved. That also means that you need a wider revenue base for the government, which in translation also means greater taxation. Are these the thinking that one needs to go through when one talks about social market economy?
Well, I think if you look at the countries in Western Europe and probably in many other parts of the world, you will see a very higher rate of taxation. But I think the social market economy, where it differs, is another principle, which is called the principle of subsidiarity. Now, what is meant about this principle is that there is a kind of a proportionment of the roles of all agents. So it is first and foremost the duty of every individual to take care of himself and his family. Only if that is not possible, then the society or the community should then step in. So, they don't jump straight away to the state. They talk about a social involvement, community and society being involved. And then only as a maybe as a third option would be the state involvement. This subsidiarity principle, I think, goes very much in hand with many of the principles that we have in the case of Malaysia. For example, I do quite a bit of research in Islamic economics, and the emphasis is on the obligation of individuals to take care of themselves, and then for their community to come in to support them, family as well as maybe society. And the state plays an important complementary role by providing certain social security in society, which comes in after individuals have tried, after the community has tried, and then you have the state, which comes in as a kind of the final maybe frontier of giving that social security.
Dr. Aslam, let's go straight down into how the changing of an economic model can impact a particular country, namely Malaysia. How do we transition from a classical capitalistic market economy to a social market economy, assuming the ability for us to do so and the political will is there? How do we transition from one model to another?
Ibrahim, there are actually quite a lot of features in Malaysia that make it easy or relatively easy to make that transition. Malaysia has never been, a neoliberal, laissez-faire economy. Although I know some people try to look at the 1950s or early 60s and they label it laissez-faire. But I would argue even in that period, there was a major government role in, for example, rural development, yeah, and the number of land schemes that were, rural development schemes that were pushed by the government. So the government has always played, an important role in the economy. But you'll see in the last maybe 30, 40 years that the biggest presence that the government has played has been in the economic sector. And this is probably for political reasons, and to address some of the maybe ethnic equity issues. But what the social market economy would, and by the way, we probably have achieved much of those issues that were big issues in the 70s and 80s, yeah, the inter-ethnic equity. What is needed in the social market economy is to actually move away from the government playing a major role in the economic sector and to move to the social sector. Health and education, I think, are two areas that have always been seen as a very important part of the social sector. We have played a role in the education sector, but I think we probably have not done as much as we could have in the health sector. So one of the things that we just needed to do, and budget is coming up, in a couple of months, would be to give more attention to the health sector. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has actually shown how important it is to have a health system that can actually cope with the big pressure that it's been facing for the last year or so.
I think since we're talking about the budget now, of course, one half of the equation is how we spend. And I couldn't agree with you more. If we spend a lot on health and education, we're looking at multi-generational dividends that can be reaped from the investments of these two sectors. But spending money wisely is only half of the conversation. We still need to talk about improving the government revenue base. We've started off with SST a few years ago, and then of course the reversal of it then we moved to GST, and then a reversal of it back to SST. And in hindsight, a lot of economists and tax policy makers are saying we shouldn't have gotten back to this or reverted back to SST. GST is a little bit more equitable, and GST enables the government to collect more with greater transparency. That's just one aspect of how the government can improve its revenue collection base. But would a social market economy create even more sources of revenue for the government? Is it business friendly? Is it able to facilitate the ease of business of Malaysians and also of foreigners opening up businesses here in this country? How capitalistic is a social market economy model to facilitate business growth?
Yeah, I have avoided using the term capitalism or the capitalist economy, and I prefer to use the market economy. Capitalism comes with a lot of ideological baggage, and personally, I would rather stick to the use of the market economy, and in this case, we're talking about a social market economy. Malaysia has always had a market economy. Some would even say it has always had a capitalist system. But you have had a huge role for the government. Whether or not that role has been played out correctly. I think that's where the modification needs to be made. We were talking about the spending that is going to be needed. Yeah? GST, SST, I think going forward in the short run, I don't think there's going to be any return to GST. You will have to make do with the lower income base in the last year. It's very clear. And therefore, what is probably needed, and I think this has been mentioned by other commentators, recently we've been talking about various packages, the recent one being Pemulih, and how are you going to fund it? Firstly, the Pemulih package seems to be rather inadequate. If you look at the amounts and what they're proposing to give and when it's going to be given, one would think that maybe more is needed. So where is the money going to come from? At the same time, we hear that our net worth of billionaires has increased, by I think in one report I read 40 billion. The net worth of our 40 billionaires or 50 billionaires has increased, by 40 billion. Some industries make windfall profits. So that could be one of the areas that you get these extra funds. Another area may not have to be government getting the money, and this is something that I wish Malaysia would think more of. We could issue what we call socially responsible investment sukuk or social impact bonds. These instruments are quite common in many countries. Investments that give a return to investors, but at the same time have a social impact. So if we could issue these papers either by the government or by GLCs, offer it to corporations or even to our T1 or T2 or T3 category of income earners in the country, and they would take it up. So we wouldn't have to rely on government spending, but give it to the community to get involved. At a micro level, let's say in IIUM, if we wanted to introduce something to help the B40 students or the B40 staff, we could try to figure out ways how we get those in the upper income brackets of that particular organization to contribute to help those in the lower levels, and this could be done nationwide. So rather than only relying on the government, you could have the government making it possible for organizations or even for the state to issue these sukuk, socially responsible investment sukuk.
One thing that I want to touch on is on the political will and the political structure of this country. Unlike Western democracies, our political parties don't normally center themselves around economic policies and economic model. They'd rather go with the rhetoric of their voting base rather than policy. And however saddening the switch in it is, that is the reality that we're facing right now. Do you feel that there is an opportunity for political parties to start embracing or rooting or anchoring their political mantra based on economic models? And since we don't have a political party that does this so prominently today, do you feel that the time is right for any political party to take up a particular economic model and argue the merits of it or the demerits of it and make it work? What do you think?
This political will component, I think, is really central in any implementation of a reform agenda. I think in the case of Malaysia, the current pandemic, although I would argue signs were there even before the pandemic, maybe even for a couple of decades, that the current model doesn't work. And I think there's this quotation about insanity. You keep doing the same thing and you expect different results. There is a need to make a change, right? And definitely this change needs to come with that political will. And that is why I think the pandemic and the current situation we are in allows us an opportunity to to make those tough decisions. We have to look beyond this model that we've been using, that has tried to utilize cheap labor, cheap capital from overseas. That was before the financial crisis of 98. We continued to use the cheap labor model, although the capital was not coming in as much. And we see the results. It's not getting us where we want to go. The government is, until today, we are still waiting for shared prosperity vision. We are waiting for 12th Malaysia plan. This is the time for serious and sincere discussion about how we can move away to a genuinely Malaysian agenda. What that means, I think, requires us to sit down and to talk about how we are going to move away. We cannot continue down the path that we have been taking and expect different results. It's just not going to work. Whether or not we have that political will, I think that I think is going to be the biggest question. Survey after survey comes out, and politicians are way down there when it comes to trust. Yeah? So we've lost that trust in the political system. But the pandemic has also shown a wonderful feature, that Malaysians have come together. Yeah, Malaysians from all ethnic groups, religious groups, have been working together, to provide, food and drinks to the frontliners, buying equipment for hospitals, right? So there is that ray of hope that we've seen in the last, few months, maybe even a year, which tells us that it can be done. The issue is, are our political leaders, listening and seeing? Yeah? And I think that really requires, for us to really sit down and take those tough measures.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of the conversation that needs to be had on this topic still, and I'm sure this wouldn't be the last time we'll be speaking to Dr. Aslam, but at the same time, we have to draw this particular conversation to a close. That was Dr. Muhammad Aslam Haneef, the Professor of Economics at IIUM. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com, look for Notepad over there. You can also look for Aslam Haneef over there as well. Until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.